The Zenithar expedition arrived at the edge of the Sol system with the casual confidence of a species that had catalogued 743 inhabited worlds. Their vessel, the Eternal Traverse, was a masterpiece of biological engineering, a living ship grown over centuries, its hull formed from layered chitin stronger than any metal, its organs processing stellar radiation into pure energy. Senior xenobiologist Kale-9 stood in the observation chamber, his 4 eyes tracking the small blue world that marked their latest discovery. Earth, the locals called it. Initial scans had been disappointing. The dominant species showed no evidence of psionic capability, no genetic manipulation, no integration with their technology. They were biological purists, trapped in fragile organic bodies, dependent on crude mechanical devices for even basic space travel. Kale-9 had seen this pattern before. Species that clung to their original forms inevitably stagnated, unable to compete with those who had embraced evolutionary advancement. He expected this would be a brief stop, a footnote in the expedition's records. Document the primitives, leave a monitoring satellite, move on to more promising worlds. His assistant, Vrina, interfaced with the ship's sensory network, her consciousness flowing through the data streams as naturally as Kale-9 breathed. She began the standard atmospheric analysis, a routine procedure they had performed hundreds of times. Every world told a story through its air, revealed the nature of life that crawled upon its surface. Vrina's primary consciousness engaged with the spectroscopic data, parsing the molecular composition of Earth's atmosphere with practiced efficiency. Then she went still. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but Kale-9 had worked with her long enough to recognize the signs of deep confusion. Her chromatophores, the color-changing cells that covered her skin, flickered through a rapid sequence of patterns that indicated cognitive dissonance. Something in the data didn't make sense. Something was wrong. Kale-9 moved closer, his own sensory tendrils reaching out to examine what had disturbed his colleague so profoundly. The atmospheric composition appeared on the shared display, and for a long moment, he simply stared at the numbers, certain there had been some error in the collection process. 20.9% oxygen. That couldn't be right. That was impossibly high. Dangerously high. The Zenithar themselves breathed an atmosphere of roughly 4% oxygen, considered optimal for complex life. Their homeworld had never exceeded 6% even during its most biologically productive eras. Oxygen was useful, necessary even, but it was also viciously reactive. It corroded, it combusted, it tore apart molecular bonds with enthusiastic efficiency. Too much oxygen and organic chemistry became unstable, proteins degraded, cellular structures collapsed. The highest oxygen level they had ever documented on an inhabited world was 11%, on a moon where the native life had evolved extraordinary antioxidant systems just to survive. But 20.9%? That wasn't an atmosphere. That was a slow-burning conflagration, a chemical weapon dispersed across an entire planet. Nothing complex should be able to survive in that concentration. Certainly nothing should be able to thrive. Kale-9 ordered a second scan, then a third, deploying every sensor array the Eternal Traverse possessed. The readings remained consistent. Earth's atmosphere was saturated with oxygen at levels that should be lethal to any carbon-based life. Yet life clearly existed there. The planet practically glowed with biological signatures, vast forests covering the continents, microscopic organisms filling the oceans, complex ecosystems layered upon ecosystems. And somewhere down there, building cities and launching primitive spacecraft, were the humans. Vrina pulled up comparative data from their xenobiological databases, her processing cores working through centuries of accumulated knowledge. There are organisms on our homeworld that produce oxygen as a waste product, she said, her voice carrying harmonic overtones of uncertainty. Photosynthetic bacteria, some algae species. But they exist in isolated environments, carefully balanced ecosystems where the oxygen they produce is quickly consumed or dispersed. An entire planetary atmosphere at these levels would require. She trailed off, the implications too staggering to articulate. Kale 9 completed the thought for her. It would require the photosynthetic organisms to have one. Completely and utterly. They would have had to proliferate across the entire planet, producing oxygen faster than it could be absorbed, until the atmosphere itself became saturated with their waste product. He felt his respiratory spiracles constrict involuntarily, an instinctive reaction to the idea of breathing air so enriched with that reactive element. And then, somehow, other life would have had to adapt. Evolve to not just tolerate that poison, but to thrive in it. To use it. The scope of what they were seeing began to crystallize in his mind. This wasn't just an unusual atmospheric composition. This was evidence of one of the most dramatic planetary transformations in the known galaxy, a complete overthrowing of the natural chemical equilibrium that governed most worlds. They dug deeper into Earth's atmospheric profile, examining isotope ratios and trace compounds, building a timeline of the planet's history. The story the data told was almost unbelievable. Roughly 2 billion years ago, by their calculations, Earth's atmosphere had been similar to most life-bearing worlds, mostly nitrogen, some carbon dioxide, trace amounts of oxygen. Then something had happened. Photosynthetic organisms had appeared, probably in the oceans first, and they had begun their inexorable transformation of the world. The oxygen levels had climbed, gradually at first, then in a catastrophic surge that would have killed almost everything alive at the time. The Zenithar databases called such events great oxidations, theoretical extinction-level disasters that destroyed conventional biochemistry. Most species in the galaxy had evolved on worlds that had avoided such calamities, where oxygen remained safely sequestered in rocks and water. But Earth hadn't avoided it. Earth had gone through it, survived it, and somehow the life that emerged on the other side had been transformed into something entirely new. Something that didn't just tolerate oxygen, it required it. The humans and every other organism on that planet had ancestors who had survived one of the most toxic catastrophes imaginable and had somehow repurposed that toxin into the foundation of their entire metabolism. Kale 9 authorized a comprehensive biological survey, suddenly aware that they might be looking at something unprecedented in their centuries of exploration. The Eternal Traverse deployed microscopic probes into Earth's atmosphere, collecting samples of air, water, soil, and tissue from dozens of different organisms. What came back exceeded every projection. The humans weren't just surviving in their oxygen-rich atmosphere. They were optimized for it in ways that made Kale 9's own species look primitive by comparison. Their blood contained specialized proteins, hemoglobin the humans called it, designed specifically to capture oxygen molecules and transport them throughout their bodies with remarkable efficiency. Their cells were packed with structures called mitochondria, tiny biological furnaces that consumed oxygen to produce energy at rates that would be impossible in a normal atmosphere. Most shocking of all, their metabolic rate was extraordinary. A human at rest processed energy at speeds that would represent peak performance for a Zenithar. When active, when engaged in physical labor or combat, their energy output increased by factors that seemed to violate thermodynamic principles. Vrina compiled the data into a comparative analysis, placing human capabilities alongside those of other species they had documented. The results were disturbing. In terms of raw strength relative to body mass, humans were unremarkable. In sensory acuity, they were actually below average, their vision covered a narrow spectrum, their hearing was limited, their sense of smell was practically vestigial compared to most predators. But in one category, they dominated every other species on record. Endurance. A human could maintain aerobic activity for hours without rest. Their cardiovascular systems could sustain elevated heart rates that would cause system failure in most organisms. They could regulate their body temperature through perspiration, allowing them to remain active in conditions that would force other species into dormancy. They could survive injuries that would be fatal to more advanced species, their robust cellular repair systems working overtime in that oxygen-rich environment to heal damage at accelerated rates. They were, in essence, biological engines running at sustained high performance, fueled by an atmosphere that would be toxic to most galactic life. Kale-9 found himself reviewing footage from Earth's surface, watching humans engaged in various activities. He saw them running for what seemed like impossible distances, their breathing labored but steady, their bodies maintaining the effort through sheer metabolic persistence. He watched construction workers labor in heat that would incapacitate a Xenothar within minutes, their sweat cooling systems allowing them to function in environmental conditions that exceeded safety parameters. He observed athletes pushing their bodies to extremes that registered as medical emergencies on Xenothar biological monitors, heart rates that indicated imminent cardiac failure, oxygen consumption rates that suggested critical hyperventilation, yet the humans simply continued, their bodies handling these extreme states as normal operating conditions. This wasn't what the Xenothar considered normal biology. This was something forged in a crucible of planetary catastrophe, honed by billions of years of evolution in an environment that most species would classify as actively hostile. The humans had dismissed such concerns casually when the Xenothar's initial contact team had inquired about their atmosphere. "It's just air," one human diplomat had said with a shrug. Just air. As if breathing a substance that could ignite entire forests was unremarkable. The expedition's medical officer, Thran X, provided additional context that deepened Kale-9's concerns. "I've been analyzing their emergency response protocols," Thran X reported, his vocal harmonics tight with anxiety. "They have extensive experience treating what they call oxygen toxicity, the condition that occurs when even they are exposed to too much oxygen. Their divers, their pilots, their medical patients, they're all aware that pure oxygen is dangerous to them. Yet their baseline atmosphere is at concentrations we would consider 50% of the way to toxic." He displayed medical imagery showing human cellular structures, pointing out the elaborate antioxidant systems, the redundant DNA repair mechanisms, the aggressive immune responses. Every cell in their bodies is equipped with systems to handle oxidative stress that would overwhelm our own biology. They're not just adapted to their environment, they're over-engineered for it. As if their evolutionary path anticipated even worse conditions and prepared accordingly. Kale-9 absorbed this information with growing unease. The Xenothar had achieved their position of prominence in the galaxy through careful genetic modification, through the gradual perfection of their biology over thousands of generations. They had eliminated weaknesses, enhanced strengths, optimized every system for maximum efficiency. Yet here were the humans, unmodified, unenhanced, still wearing essentially the same bodies their ancestors had possessed 50,000 years ago. And those primitive, unchanged bodies were capable of feats that would require significant genetic engineering for a Xenothar to match. It suggested something uncomfortable about the nature of evolution, about the relationship between environment and capability. The Xenothar had optimized themselves for comfort, for efficiency, for a carefully controlled existence. The humans had been forged in conditions that actively tried to kill them, and they had emerged as endurance predators capable of simply outlasting almost any threat. Vrina brought up another disturbing finding. "I've been examining their military capabilities," she said. "Not their weapons, we knew their technology was primitive. But their training regimens, their combat doctrines, their expectations of what their soldiers can endure." She displayed video of human military training, individuals carrying heavy loads across vast distances, functioning without sleep for extended periods, operating in temperature extremes from Arctic cold to desert heat. They train by deliberately pushing their bodies to the edge of failure, then recovering and doing it again. They build endurance through systematic stress. And their military operations assume capabilities that we would require cybernetic enhancement to achieve. The Xenothar Council convened to review the expedition's findings, their collective consciousness gathering in the neural network that connected their homeworld. Kale-9 presented his data with careful precision, knowing how radical his conclusions would sound. For centuries, the Xenothar had operated under the assumption that biological evolution had limits, that species like themselves who had transcended their original forms represented the pinnacle of development. The discovery of humanity challenged that assumption in fundamental ways. The Council's prime consciousness, an amalgamation of their oldest and wisest minds, processed the information with characteristic thoroughness. When it spoke, its voice carried the weight of collective judgment. You're suggesting that these humans, by virtue of evolving in a hostile environment, possess inherent advantages over species like ourselves who have achieved technological transcendence? Kale9 chose his words carefully. I'm suggesting that we've been measuring advancement incorrectly. We've focused on technological sophistication, on the integration of biology and machinery, on the optimization of comfortable existence. The humans evolved under conditions that forced different adaptations. They didn't need to become efficient, they needed to become relentless. He pulled up comparative metabolic data, showing the energy consumption rates of various galactic species. A xenothar can operate at peak performance for approximately 1.3 hours before requiring rest and metabolic rebalancing. A human can maintain near peak performance for 6 to 8 hours, then recover with only brief rest periods. In a sustained conflict, in any scenario that requires prolonged physical effort, they will simply outlast us. Not through superior technology or tactics, but through sheer biological persistence. The implications rippled through the Council's collective consciousness. The xenothar had never considered endurance a particularly valuable trait. Their ships could travel between stars, their weapons could destroy planets, their technology could reshape matter at the molecular level. What did it matter if an individual could run for a long time? But Kale9's data suggested scenarios where it mattered greatly. Ground combat in environments where technology failed. Survival situations where resourcefulness and persistence determined outcomes. Colonial efforts on harsh worlds where daily existence required constant physical effort. The humans hadn't needed to engineer solutions to these challenges. They were already equipped for them, their bodies honed by billions of years in an atmosphere that never let them rest, never let them become soft. Vrina added her own analysis to the presentation. I've been studying their cultural artifacts, their mythology, and entertainment. They have a concept they call persistence hunting. Before they developed projectile weapons, their ancestors would chase prey animals for hours or even days, following them at a steady pace until the prey collapsed from exhaustion. The humans would barely be breathing hard. She paused, letting that sink in. They also have numerous cultural narratives about humans being the slow knife, about victory through patient persistence rather than overwhelming force. It's deeply embedded in their psychology, this understanding that they can simply keep going when others cannot. The Council processed this information, running probability matrices and tactical simulations. In every scenario that involved prolonged engagement, the humans showed unexpected advantages. A xenothar strike team could achieve overwhelming initial success, but if the conflict extended beyond a few hours, human defenders would still be operating at near full capacity while the xenothar forces degraded rapidly. It was a disturbing revelation for a species that had never considered physical endurance a strategic factor. Thranex provided the medical perspective that made the situation even more complex. I need to address the atmospheric compatibility issue. Our preliminary contact protocols assumed that humans would require environmental suits in our ships, and we would require suits on their world. But the reality is more problematic. He displayed tolerance charts showing the lethal zones for various atmospheric compositions. A human can function in our atmosphere with only mild discomfort. The low oxygen levels would reduce their performance, cause fatigue, but they could survive for extended periods without technological assistance. They've even demonstrated this capability naturally. They have populations living at high altitudes where oxygen levels are significantly lower than their sea level baseline. He switched to the reverse scenario. A xenothar exposed to Earth's atmosphere would experience oxidative damage within minutes. Our cellular structures can't process those oxygen levels safely. We would require comprehensive environmental protection, sealed suits with sophisticated filtering systems, constant medical monitoring. In any conflict on their world, they have an immediate and insurmountable environmental advantage. The strategic implications were clear. The Zenithar had catalogued hundreds of worlds, had encountered dozens of spacefaring species, and had always operated from a position of technical superiority. Their bioships were more advanced, their weapons more powerful, their understanding of physics more complete. But superiority in space meant little if you couldn't operate on the ground. And Earth's ground belonged entirely to the humans, protected by an atmosphere that served as a natural defense system against most galactic species. Kale 9 concluded his presentation with a recommendation that sent shock waves through the Council. We should classify humanity as a Category 5 species, potential peer competitors. Not because of their current technology, but because their fundamental biology gives them strategic advantages that our technology cannot easily counter. They are not weak primitives to be catalogued and monitored. They are survivors of a planetary catastrophe that would have sterilized most worlds, and they have been shaped by that survival into something formidable. The debate that followed consumed days of council time. Some members argued for immediate technological uplift, sharing advanced knowledge with humanity to accelerate their development into proper galactic citizens. Others advocated for careful isolation, avoiding any conflict that might test their newfound understanding of human capabilities. The decision came from an unexpected source. Elder historian Quantek, one of the oldest consciousnesses in the Zenithar collective, had remained silent throughout the debates. When she finally spoke, her words carried the authority of one who had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations across centuries. I have been reviewing our historical archives, Quantek began, her voice resonating with harmonics of deep memory. Searching for parallels to what we've discovered about Earth. And I found something troubling. She projected data from a world the Zenithar had encountered nearly 3 centuries ago, a planet they had designated as Hostile Environment 7. The dominant species there had evolved in crushing gravity, twice what most galactic species considered habitable. They were short, heavily muscled, with skeletal structures that could support enormous loads. The Zenithar had catalogued them, noted their unusual strength, and moved on. 50 years later, that species had developed space travel and had begun expanding aggressively through their local stellar neighborhood. Their technology wasn't particularly advanced, but their colonists could survive in high-gravity environments that other species couldn't even visit without sophisticated support systems. We dismissed them as primitives, Quantek continued. We failed to recognize that their primitive biology was actually a strategic advantage. They could colonize worlds we couldn't, could operate in environments we had to avoid. By the time we understood the implications, they had established themselves across 17 systems. She shifted the display to show current data. They're now one of the more successful colonial powers in that sector, not because they're technologically superior, but because they can thrive where others struggle. The parallel to humanity was obvious. The Zenithar were making the same mistake again, assuming that technological advancement was the only metric that mattered. They were failing to account for the strategic value of biological adaptation, of being able to operate without technological support in environments that would kill other species. Quantek's conclusion was stark. If we treat humanity as primitives, as we did with the high-gravity species, we will create the same problem. But we cannot afford to make that mistake with a species whose biological advantages are even more significant. The humans don't need high-gravity worlds. They can operate almost anywhere. Their endurance, their adaptability, their tolerance for their own hostile environment, these traits will serve them well across dozens of different world types. The Council's attention shifted to Admiral Zextar, the military strategist who had been silently running combat simulations throughout the discussions. When prompted to share her findings, her response was blunt. We cannot win a ground war against humanity on any oxygen-rich world. Our advantages in space combat and orbital superiority become irrelevant if we cannot hold territory on the surface. And approximately 37% of habitable worlds in charted space have oxygen levels that would give humans a significant operational advantage. She displayed battlefield projections, each one showing the same pattern. Initial Xenothar forces achieve objectives through superior firepower and coordination. Human defenders fall back, regroup, and begin sustained operations. Within 6 to 8 hours, Xenothar forces require rotation and rest. Human forces continue operating. Within 24 hours, Xenothar casualties from exhaustion and environmental stress exceed combat losses. Within 48 hours, our positions become untenable. The simulations were damning. Every scenario that involved prolonged ground operations favored the humans simply because they could keep fighting when other species had to stop. It wasn't about courage or tactics or technology, it was pure biology. Kale-9 watched the Council process these revelations, saw the shift in collective understanding. The Xenothar had encountered something they had never expected, a species that was simultaneously primitive and advanced, weak and formidable. The humans had weak technology but strong biology. They lacked psionic abilities but possessed metabolic capabilities that achieved similar results through different means. They were, in essence, a reminder that evolution had many paths to power, and the Xenothar's path was not inherently superior to all others. The vote, when it came, was nearly unanimous. Humanity would be approached not as primitives to be guided, but as potential equals to be respected. First contact protocols would be revised to acknowledge the strategic reality. Earth was not a weak world to be dominated, but a fortress world defended by an atmosphere that most galactic species couldn't safely breathe and inhabitants who could fight longer, endure more, and survive conditions that would break other civilizations. Vrina raised one final point that had been bothering her throughout the analysis. "We've been focused on military applications," she said. "But consider the economic and social implications. The humans are going to want to explore, to colonize, to expand. And they're going to target worlds that other species consider marginal, high-oxygen worlds, extreme environments, places where their natural advantages are maximized." She displayed a galactic map showing worlds that had been surveyed and dismissed as too hostile for colonization. There are thousands of planets with oxygen levels above 15%. We've avoided them. Most species avoid them. But to humans, those worlds would be paradise, familiar, comfortable, requiring minimal terraforming. The implications crystallized. The humans weren't going to compete with the Xenothar for the comfortable, optimized worlds that most species preferred. They were going to claim the difficult worlds, the hostile environments, the places where their biology gave them advantages. They would build an empire not by conquering others, but by thriving where others couldn't. It was a strategy that no one had anticipated because no other species had the biological foundation to execute it. Kale-9 felt something he hadn't experienced in his long career of xenobiological research. A sense of having witnessed something genuinely new, genuinely unexpected. The galaxy had room for many different types of intelligence, many forms of power. The Xenothar had assumed their path was optimal, but humanity proved that optimization came in many forms. 3 months after the initial discovery, the Xenothar made formal contact with humanity. The meeting took place on a neutral station, carefully constructed with dual atmospheric zones to accommodate both species. Kale-9 served as the Xenothar's chief representative, accompanied by a diplomatic team that had been extensively briefed on human psychology and capabilities. The human delegation was led by Ambassador Elena Rodriguez, a woman whose calm demeanor masked the keen intelligence evident in her questions. She listened carefully as Kale-9 explained the Xenothar's findings, the atmospheric analysis that had led to their revised understanding of human capabilities. When he finished, she smiled, an expression that Kale-9 had learned indicated amusement rather than aggression. "You're not the first to underestimate us because of our technology level," Rodriguez said. "But you might be the first to actually understand why that's a mistake." She gestured to the viewport showing Earth in the distance. Our planet tried to kill us for billions of years. The atmosphere, the predators, the diseases, the climate, everything about our world has been a constant test. We didn't transcend those challenges through technology. We survived them through adaptation, through becoming the kind of species that simply doesn't quit. Kale 9 appreciated her directness. Your biology is remarkable, he said. We've spent centuries engineering ourselves to be more efficient, more comfortable, more optimized for controlled environments. You've remained essentially unchanged for hundreds of thousands of years, yet your baseline capabilities exceed our engineered modifications in specific crucial areas. Rodriguez nodded. We have a saying, necessity is the mother of invention. But sometimes necessity is also the mother of evolution. Our ancestors didn't choose to breathe corrosive oxygen or develop persistence hunting strategies. They did it because the alternative was extinction. Every human alive today is descended from survivors, from individuals who could keep going when everything said they should stop. She paused, considering her next words carefully. We're not superior to the Xenothar or any other species. We're just different. We evolved different solutions to different problems. You optimized for intelligence and efficiency. We optimized for endurance and adaptability. Both strategies work. Both have value. It was a gracious response, more diplomatic than the raw data deserved. Kale 9 had seen the combat simulations, knew the strategic advantages humanity possessed. But he also understood what Rodriguez was offering, a framework for mutual respect rather than competition. The discussions that followed laid the groundwork for what would become a historic alliance. The Xenothar offered technological knowledge, access to their extensive databases of stellar cartography and xenobiology. In exchange, humans agreed to provide personnel for joint colonial efforts on high-oxygen worlds, to serve as ground force advisors for Xenothar military operations, and to share their expertise in surviving hostile environments. It was a partnership built on honest assessment of capabilities rather than comfortable assumptions. Vrina, observing the negotiations, found herself impressed by human pragmatism. They didn't posture or make aggressive demands. They simply acknowledged their strengths, understood their weaknesses, and worked to build arrangements that benefited both species. It was the approach of a civilization that had learned patience through necessity, that understood the value of sustainable cooperation over short-term dominance. As the formal agreements were signed, Kale 9 reflected on how much his understanding had changed since that first atmospheric scan. He had arrived at Earth expecting to catalog primitives and had instead discovered a species that challenged fundamental assumptions about evolution and advancement.
Months later, when the first joint colony was established on a high-oxygen world designated New Covenant, Kale 9 stood in the observation dome and watched human colonists working alongside Xenothar engineers. The humans moved with casual confidence in the oxygen-rich atmosphere, performing heavy labor that would require robotic assistance for most species. They worked longer shifts, recovered faster, and approached the hostile environment with the ease of those who had never known anything gentler. A young human colonist approached him during a rest period, curious about the Xenothar's biological ship technology. They talked for hours, exchanging knowledge, finding common ground in their shared curiosity about the universe. As the conversation wound down, the colonist said something that struck Kale 9 as profoundly human. You know, my great-grandmother used to say that Earth wasn't trying to kill us. It was trying to teach us. Every challenge, every threat, every hostile element, they were all lessons in survival. We learned to breathe fire, to outlast the tireless, to thrive in poison. And now we take those lessons to the stars. It was a perspective that reframed everything. The humans didn't see their hostile environment as a burden or a weakness. They saw it as their greatest teacher, the forge that had shaped them into who they were. Kale 9 thought about his own species, about their comfortable ships and optimized bodies, about the careful control they maintained over their environment. The Xenothar had removed themselves from evolutionary pressure, had stopped letting the universe teach them hard lessons. Perhaps that was why they had stopped growing in unexpected ways, why their development had become predictable and incremental. The humans were still being taught. Their atmosphere still demanded endurance, their bodies still required constant maintenance, their world still pushed them to adapt and overcome. They hadn't transcended the struggle, they had embraced it, made it part of their identity. As Kale-9 returned to the Eternal Traverse, preparing for the journey back to Zenithar space, he composed a final report to the Council. It contained recommendations for enhanced cooperation with humanity, for joint research projects and cultural exchanges. But it also contained something more personal, a reflection on the nature of strength. "We have measured advancement by our ability to control our environment," he wrote. "To engineer comfort and eliminate struggle. Humanity reminds us that there is another form of advancement, the ability to thrive in struggle, to find strength in adversity, to become anti-fragile rather than merely resilient." He considered the atmospheric scan that had started everything, the moment when he had seen those impossible oxygen levels and realized he was looking at something unprecedented. That scan had revealed more than chemistry, it had revealed a fundamental truth about evolution and survival. The species that thrived weren't always the ones who built the most comfortable environments. Sometimes they were the ones who learned to breathe fire and call it air, who took poison and made it fuel, who faced a world trying to kill them and emerged as hunters, explorers, survivors. The Zenithar had dismissed humans as weak because their technology was primitive. They had failed to see that weakness and strength came in many forms, that a species didn't need advanced shields and weapons if their own biology was their greatest defense. Earth's atmosphere. That toxic, corrosive, impossible air, wasn't a weakness. It was a moat, a barrier, a testing ground that had forged something remarkable. And the humans who breathed it weren't weak primitives. They were the survivors of the longest, hardest test in their planet's history, and they carried the lessons of that test in every cell of their oxygen-hungry, relentlessly enduring bodies. Kale-9 sealed the report and transmitted it across the stars, knowing it would challenge comfortable assumptions and force difficult discussions. But that was good. Comfort, after all, was the enemy of growth. The humans had learned that lesson in an atmosphere of fire. Perhaps it was time for the Zenithar to learn it too.